Hi everyone, this is Nathan from Snap and welcome to another of our Snap XMP webinars. This is the second of 3 webinars in our mini-series titled Group Questionnaires and 360 Surveys. In the first session, we looked at the design aspect of a group questionnaire, which enabled a series of similar questionnaires to be distributed to our participant using a single survey link. In today's webinar, which is part 2, we will look at the analysis side of the group questionnaire, and then in part 3 in April, we will be focusing on using similar functionality to produce a 360 survey. There are 3 main elements to running reports. Initially, we need to build the tables and charts, and this is likely to involve the creation of some additional variables to allow us to benchmark and compare data. We then need to construct the reports. This means the building up of the reports chart by chart, adding your commentary along the way. And then we'll look at how these reports might be shared, allowing your stakeholders to self-serve rather than being reliant on you providing regular updates. A few key benefits to the analysis of a group questionnaire. Like with the design, we are dealing with one single survey file, which simply means that there's less work to do. So if you need to build a chart or create a derived variable, you're doing that once in one survey rather than having to repeat the process in multiple individual surveys. And this is especially beneficial when making updates to your reporting. It's one single survey, which means all the data is contained in one location. So again, there's no need to end up merging data files. And this allows the benchmarking and comparison of live data, whether that's benchmarking your live data against static targets, be that KPIs, previous data, or perhaps competitor data, or whether you wish to compare and benchmark data across your live data set, so comparing departments or areas, etc. As we're making use of smart reporting, we can add dynamic commentary to our reports, referencing the live data that's coming in. And then finally, we can make use of sharing, which allows stakeholders to log in and view their live data at any time of day or night, negating the need for you to provide regular updates. A reminder of some common example uses for group questionnaires would be training programs where employees are asked to evaluate their different courses that they've been on. Product testing, where a participant is asked to complete a questionnaire about a product at various intervals throughout the testing process, or perhaps complete a different questionnaire for each of the different products that they're testing. And then today's example will be taking the scenario of a university or college where students are asked to complete questionnaires for the different modules or courses that they've taken throughout the year. And then another use of this functionality would be a 360 survey, and this is used in organisations allowing employees to give feedback on the individual, so themselves, but also on their peers, their superiors and their subordinates. That's the example that we're going to be looking at in our webinar coming up in April. Okay, let's head into the software and take a look at the setup of those reports. So we're going to be looking at the survey we used last week. Actually just named it analysis webinar just to make sure I know which one we're looking at. And it's got 624 cases in. So might only be sort of 15, 20, 30, who knows, number of sort of participants that filled in the survey. But remember, each of those participants would have filled in the survey multiple times. So one for each of the modules that they completed. Now, before I start, it probably is worth mentioning that I'm going to be going through a lot of options and ideas and in fairly quick succession. So I would definitely recommend making use of the fact that this is being recorded today. So do go back and watch it back. It'll be available on our support hub in a couple of days. This will allow you to pause it to sort of check what's going on, and also just remind you of some of the things that I'm covering. And on that note, at the end, I'm going to be pointing you off to another webinar I did a little while back, which covered some good tips on creating an engaging report in the first place. And it also sort of shows you how to build up your reports in a bit more detail, because I'm going to be sort of glossing over some of that today. But looking at our survey today, if you remember, it's got some hidden questions at the top of our survey. Just show you these. And these are going to form the basis for all of the filtering and running of our reports later. And these are the questions which were sort of seeded when someone fills in the survey. So the person filling in the survey doesn't actually say which school they're in or which module they're taking or which tutor they had. That will all be based on the link that they click on. And as I said, we're going to be sort of filtering our reports based on these. Now, I say filtering, we're actually going to be making use of filtering to context, which works a little bit differently to normal filtering. And the easiest way I can probably explain this is if you were to look at a street. So if you were to stand in your street, you can obviously see all your houses in the street, not your houses, but all the houses in the street. So effectively you can see all the data. If I was then to head into my house and look out the window, I can obviously still see all the houses in my street. But if I was to close the curtains, I've then filtered out all of the other houses and with it, all the data that belong to those other houses. So we're left with just the data from my own house. So that's sort of normal filtering where you're effectively closing the curtains on all the other data. When we're filtering to context, which we're going to look at in more detail later, we don't actually close the curtains on those windows. We still carry on looking out the window and seeing all those other houses, all the other data, but we're looking at the data from the viewpoint of my house. So you might be in the corporate finance house. You can still see the other data, all the other modules, but it's from the viewpoint of the corporate finance. So as I said, we're going to be looking at that in more detail a bit later. So I'm just going to hide those again. And just to remind you, my questionnaire is mainly set up of rating scale questions. And they're broken down into different topics or different sections. So we've got learning and teaching, feedback and assessment. But you can see they're all sort of 5-point scales, strongly agree to strongly disagree. Now, one of the first things we're going to look at is some derived variables. So you can see these are 5-point scales. And I've got question sort of 9A to 9D. See, starting off here, we've got question 4A to 4D, E, etc. So I'm just going to close down my questionnaire design window and head into the variables window. So these are obviously all the questions in my survey. Got my main sort of questions 1 to question whatever it goes up to, number 13. But I've got lots of other variables down here, and you can see they've got slightly different icons. The normal variables have sort of tick box options down there, or if it's an open-ended question, just a sort of a bit like an open box. For what's known as a derived variable, we've got this little squiggly line. And if I go straight into VQ3A, now I've named this V and then the actual name of the original question, just so I know that VQ3A actually relates back to, I think I possibly named that one wrong. In fact, I apologise, I meant VQ4A relates back to question 4A. So if I double click on VQ4A, and if I go into the toggle the definition icon, you can see that the data is based on question 4A, so the original tick box question in the survey, and anyone who chose option 1 or 2 will go into the category of agree. Anyone that chose number 3, which was the third option, will be neutral, and anyone that chose disagree or strongly disagree will go into the disagree category. So I've effectively created a sort of a cut down version of the original question. Originally it was a 5-point scale, now it's just a 3-point scale, and you can see I've done that for pretty much all of my questions, to be honest, because when it comes to the analysis, I'm not too bothered how strongly they disagree or not. In some situations I will, but for most of my reporting, I just want to know if they agree or disagree. So various different questions, all pointing off to the original different source question, but still all using that same 5-point scale. And the other benefit of this derived variable is it allows me to rename some of my questions. So some of my original questions are actually quite long. So this is one way of sort of perhaps changing some of the answer text, as I've done here, and also changing some of the label text, which is what's going to be appearing in my tables and charts. Now, as I said, my survey was made up of lots of different sections or areas, and you can see I've got my question VQ4A down to VQ4E, and then it starts 6A to 6F. whilst I do sometimes want to do analysis based on one of those individual questions, sometimes we want to look at the sort of section as a whole. So if I go up to analysis variables, within here we've got what's known as a group variable. I've just clicked on the plus to create a new group variable. If we look at question or GB2 group variable 2, it's based on that section learning and teaching. But more importantly, all it's actually doing is taking the data from those 4 or 5 derived variables and effectively merging it into one variable to give me an overall sort of data set for that particular section. And you can see I've actually got 5 different sections, and I've actually created 5 group variables. Moving back to my variables list, I've also got some variables down the bottom which are grouping together which different courses my different tutors run. So if I double click on Baker, so Professor Julie Baker, they took 2 courses or ran 2 courses, the computer applications course and the computer programming skills course. So anyone who says that they completed module 7 or module 6 will be attached to Baker. And if I look at Michael's, anyone who completed module 9 or module 8 will be attached to Michael's. So again, when it comes to doing our analysis in just a moment, we'll be making use of all these derived variables which are sort of chopping up our data into different categories. So effectively a derived variable more than anything is sort of simplifying our analysis. So let's actually head to look at some of our analysis now. So I'll go back to Baker 1. So Baker was looking at 2 courses, the computer applications and the computer programming. And if we go and look at some of my tables and charts that we've got, again, lots and lots of tables and charts today. I'm not going to be going into them all today, but at the top, I've got a group of charts all for Professor Baker, and also a group of charts all for Dr. Brown. And you can see I've tried to name them, so that's based on the section 4 question, which I think was learning and teaching. That was section 6. But if I go into the Baker question or Baker chart, smaller, go into the properties of that chart. So you can see it's making use of question 4, A, B, C, D and E. So the original sort of 5-point strongly agree to strongly disagree question. It's making use of the Baker, which was that variable in the moment, which split out into my 2 different courses that Professor Julie Baker took. The data has been filtered based on a question called year. So again, I'll just quickly show you year whilst we're here. Now, of course, these are just all ideas of things that I've done. It's not to say that your report should be doing exactly what I'm doing here. But in my case, I've got a derived variable. I'm kind of, in my example, assuming that we perhaps run this over 2 years. So I've got the data for this year, and I've got the data for last year. There's different terminology we could use here. Here I've been really specific to say it is 2024. There are ways of using different sort of words in there to try and automate it. So when we get to 2025, I don't necessarily have to come in here and change it to 2025. So again, it just depends sort of whether it's an ongoing project or if it's a one-off project. So I'm only looking at the data for 2024. And this particular chart is displaying the mean scores. Now, again, looking at this information on its own here, you wouldn't necessarily know that, but when I show you this in the report in a moment, it will have a little introduction saying that we're going to look at the mean scores for each of these questions. And it's working out those mean scores based on a weight, which is WT4. So if we go and look at WT4, what it's actually doing is allocating a point to the different to the answers. So as I said, ours, we've got the strongly agree to strongly disagree. So it's been coded up to score sort of 1 to 5. But actually, let's open up my weights, because our survey is actually going positive to negative. So look at WT4. Answer number 1 is the strongly agree. That's actually going to be worth 5 points. Answer 2 is the agree, which is worth 4 points, and strongly disagree, answer 5, is worth 1 point. So I've actually reversed the scale. Obviously, you might have some questions which go good to bad and other ones which go bad to good. So you might need a number of different weights. Okay, so here that's looking at the different scores for, or the average scores for the different modules, or for that particular module and that particular course that's run by Julie Baker. If we now look at a couple of other charts, I've got one called C Engage Summary. So I always name my chart C. It's to do with the engaged section, so personal engagement, and it's a summary. So this time it's actually making use of those derived variables which I showed you near the beginning. So just to remind you, VQ11A, go back into my variables. So question 11A was the original 5-point scale, strongly agree to strongly disagree, but VQ11A was my reduced sort of 3-point scale. Let's close that down. So this time it's making use of those 2 derived variables, so that's why we've only got the 3-point scale. And again, it's filtering it based on year 1. So it's only got this year's data, but it's also making use of module. And this is where I was talking about context. So rather than it saying module equals 1 or module equals 2 or 3 or essentially one of 11, it's saying module equals module at context, which is a little bit strange. But if I just leave that up there for the time being and go up to File and Context Values, within here you can see I've got my 3 main variables, one of which is module, and that's set to number 3 at the moment. So really that filter is actually saying module, sorry, it's really saying module equals 3 and year equals 1. If I was to change that to number 4, it would really be saying module equals 4 and year equals 1. And it seems a bit strange how this is set up at the moment, but when we come to running the reports, this number in the background will be automatically changing. So as I said, there's I think 11 different modules, so the report will run once when this is set to number 1, then it will automatically in the background change it to number 2, 3, 4. So effectively we will end up with 9 different reports, 11 different reports for each of the different modules. Likewise, there's 5 different tutors, so there'll be 5 different tutor reports, and there's 2 different departments, so there'd be 2 different department reports. Okay. So this one was looking at personal engagement, just looking at V11A to V11D. There's another one doing exactly the same, I think, for another section, so the feedback section. Again, just looking at 2 of my derived variables, 2 of the key ones, so Q6C and Q6F, but again, the derived variable version of it. But then I've got another one, which is making use of those group variables. So if you remember, for each section, there's potentially 4 or 5 different questions. These were looking at the individual questions, but the group variable is looking at the section as a whole. So that's making use of GB2, 3, 4, and 5. So group variable 2, 3, 4, and 5. To remind you what the group variables were, these were the group variables where GB2 was looking at all the questions within that particular section. Okay, so I've got my data broken down in lots and lots of different ways, sometimes looking at individual data, sometimes looking at grouped data, and really a big part of sort of creating reports is to try not to make one report which does everything, So don't try and create one giant report. Think about creating different reports for different people. So it might be that the individual tutors need to look at just the overall data, whilst the maybe heads of department want to look at the individual questions. So it might be that some reports have this overall one in, whilst other reports will perhaps have it broken down into the individual questions. Okay, and on the subject of chopping your data up in lots of different ways, I've got one more chart just to quickly show you, which is called CV Compare. So I'm going to look at CV4C Compare. And what this one's doing is effectively benchmarking your data or comparing your data for a particular course. So this is currently set to corporate finance, and if I come up to file and context and go back into my global, you can see that that's set to corporate finance. If I was to set this to number 4, financial analysis and valuation, you can see my chart's out of date. So it's automatically changed to financial analysis and valuation, as has all the data. So I'm going to pop it back to number 3. Okay. So again, to show you how this is set up, so if I go into the properties of my chart, so it's looking at Q4C, but again, the drive variable, the 3-point scale, it's looking at this year's data, but it's chopping my data up based on a variable called compare year 1. So again, let's go and look at compare year 1. That is a divide variable. You can see I've actually got 2, one for this year, one for last year. But if we look at this year, so I've chopped my data up into 3 different categories. So I've got my first category, which is this first row, which is saying, give me the data for whatever the current module is. So mine's currently set to corporate finance. The middle row is give me the data for everybody, or everybody in this year at least, year 1. And then the final option is saying, show me the data for everybody, but excluding anyone who is in effectively corporate finance. So when I run this course for a completely different module, the first one will be for that separate module, and then the last one will be everything except for whatever's in that first module. So it's a way of sort of comparing your data, taking that scenario of looking out the window. You can see your data because you're in your own house. You can still see everyone else's data, but more of just sort of an overview as opposed to looking at each of the houses individually. So lots of different charts are being built, making use of lots of derived variables, lots of weights and lots of group variables. Obviously, your reports don't have to be as detailed as this. You don't have to sort of chop it up in hundreds of different ways, but I'm just giving you some ideas. Let's now have a quick look at the reports. So I've got lots and lots of reports, but most of these are just what I'd call sort of mini reports. So all these ones here with the word no on them, they're actually sort of mini reports which are being used to form the basis of those ones in the middle. So for example, we look at the tutor report. I've got a mini report called FC Tutor, which is actually the front cover report. I've got executive summary for the tutor, and I've also got the results. So those 3 mini reports are actually going to form the total report, which is this one. So if I double click on that main report, you can see it's going to run the front cover report, it's going to run the executive summary report, and it's going to run the results tutor report. But let's go and look at those mini reports. So if I look at the front cover report, Again, not going to be going into too much detail about how these are created because we've covered this in other webinars, and I'll be pointing you to those a bit later. But a report is made up of different instructions. So you can see I've got a page layout, I've got a front cover, information window. If I double click on that one, got some text in there, I've got some inserted text. So when we run the report for a particular tutor, the name of that tutor will appear in there. It's got the date. So again, just basically making use of the insert button when we can insert various dynamic features. Plus I've also got some sort of words and some logos down there as well. But when you run it as a whole, I just preview that. You can see I get my front cover. That's the name of one of my tutors. We look at the executive summary for the tutor. So this time it's got 19 different instructions, so it's starting to get more and more complex. So again, page layouts, got some text in there with, again, some dynamic inserted text. But more importantly, we've got some of those tables that I was showing you earlier. So those have been executed, which basically you go and grab one of the charts that you've previously produced earlier. And this is where it's useful having sort of named them all sensibly. So if I run this report, you can see I get a mixture of my tables and charts, or my charts, plus I've got some seeded data in there. And I've actually got some other derived variables in there, which is working out the response rate. So I'm not going to go into how I've done that, but I've potentially got different response rates for the different courses. If I look at the main part of the report, which is the results tutor, so again, it's getting even more complex with 34 different instructions. And this is kind of my idea for having these mini reports, is that if you have it as one huge report, then you're going to end up with hundreds of instructions, and you can sometimes sort of lose track of where you are. So I find it better to have these mini reports, and there's various benefits to it, which I'll show you in just a second as well. So again, lots and lots of instructions in there. Most of these are actually charts. So you notice I've got 5 charts there, one for each of my tutors, all for question 4. And then I've got 5 charts, all for question 6 for my different tutors. But if I double click on Baker, you can see I've got an NA expression. So a little bit like routing, basically, when will this not appear? Now, just to confuse you or potentially simplify it, depending on which way your mind is wired, I've got a not in there. So this is effectively a double negative. So effectively the NA and the not cancel each other out. So effectively we're saying, when will this appear? So that particular chart, which is all about Professor Baker, will appear when the report is run for the context of tutor equals 3, which is Baker. So Baker's number 3. If I look at Michael's, tutor number 4. So again, if you cancel the NA and the not is cancelled out. So Michael's will appear when the tutor is set to number 4. So just to remind you, we go back to our questionnaire. Yeah, you can see Sam Michaels is number 4. I think I said remember Baker was number 3. So yes, so that's where it's sort of grabbing those from. So although there are 34 different instructions in them, it's not to say 34 different tables and charts are going to appear, because only one of those will appear, only one of those will appear, only one of those will appear, etc. Okay, so those different charts and those different sort of mini reports, as I said, there's 3 of them in total. They all merge into this master report. And you can see this report is going to run for each of the different tutors. So there's 5 different tutors. If I press the play button, just preview it today. I've got one report for John Marder. This is all John Marder's data, broken down by the different courses, etc. Then I get another report for Claire Short. This is all Claire Short's data. So although I've got one report, out of it, I'm actually getting 5 separate reports. And you notice that it's sort of jumping onto a document break. If you were to actually print this off or run it to a PDF, it would produce actual separate different PDFs, and it would name them accordingly. Likewise, if I run the module report, so it's going to be a longer report this time, again running it for each of the modules and the tutors. In fact, this is actually making use of module tutor. So we've got a question called module. We've also got a question called tutor. This is using something called module tutor. If I go up to context, so I've got my 4 or my 3 individual ones. So department, tutor, and module. I want to run the report for each of the tutors and modules. So it's going to run a report for any of the combinations that exist here. So where one particular tutor runs one particular module for one particular department, you will get one report. What you won't get is a report for a tutor that doesn't exist with a particular module or department. So for example, John Marder is from the accountancy department, I think. There will not be a report for John Marder for the business department because no data exists for that combination. It will only produce a report for any combination where all 3 of those have data. So I run this report. I've got John Marder for financial risk. John Marder's run 2 courses. This is all about the financial risk management course. John Marder also ran the corporate finance, so he's going to get a report for that one as well. And then again, each of these tutors have all run 2 courses each, so effectively I'm going to get 10 reports out of this one report. Now, just to finish off, here we've been making use of these reports and running them myself internally, which produces a PDF, which you would then, I guess, have to either upload to a website somewhere or email out to people. Ideally, though, we want people to self-serve. So you want the different tutors to be able to run their own reports, or you want the different department managers or the university heads of university to run the reports themselves. So I potentially got 5 different tutors and maybe 2 different heads of department, as in the business department and the accountancy department, and I've maybe also got a head of university. So if you notice on available, I'm making use of something called reports. So some say reports 1 to 3, some 2 to 3, some 1 to 3, etc., and some no reply. So final thing is just to look at how we can share these results, but we don't want to give everyone access to every report. We could do if we wanted to. We would just actually leave this blank, and that would actually give everyone access to everything. But here we're talking about maybe only giving certain people access to certain reports. So under my variables, I've created a derived variable called report access. Tutor is number 1, head of department is number 2, and university head is number 3. So there's no data attached to these. It just means that I know that the tutor report will be visible to any of these people, 1, 2, or 3. The department report will only be available for the department lead or the university head, and the module report will also be available to all of these 3 people. What I've also done is added an expression of, okay, it's available for anyone that's a 1, 2, or 3, but also I want to make sure that when I log in, I can view the reports as well. So I'm not a head of department or a tutor or anything else. I'm just the survey designer. So I'm effectively a no reply. Now, that will all make sense, or make a little bit more sense in just sort of a minute when we log into Snap Online and show you how it's set up in there. Okay, and you notice that these reports, I've got one report. If we look at the module report, I've got one called internal, which will produce a separate report for each of my different tutors and modules. But I've got the same report, which is only going to produce one report. So it will produce a report for a particular module or a particular tutor, depending on who that tutor or who that particular tutor is. Likewise for the department, that one will produce two reports, one for each of the departments. The department heads will actually be viewing this one though, and this is where the accountancy department will only view their one report and the business department will only view their report. Okay, so again, just remembering this little bit here of reports equals 1, 2, 3 or 4, depending on who they are. So if I log into Snap Online, hopefully this doesn't log me out. So I've got my survey in Snap Online, and this is my account, my sort of training account, if you like. If I go into, you can see I've got those 6 reports because there were 6 reports which had no reply next to them. So that's why I can see all of those 6 reports. But if I go into the shares, I've shared this with 5 different accounts. Now, obviously you can have to use your imagination here, but person 1 and 2, they are my two of my tutors. So if I go and look at person number 1 is John Marder. So it's specifying here that they are tutor number 1, John Marder, and John Marder has ran 2 courses, options number 1 and 3, which was the financial risk and the corporate finance. And I've specified that John Marder is reports equals number 1, which relates back to number 1, a tutor. So number 1, John Marder should be able to see that report because it's got a number 1 on it, and that report because it's also got a number 1 on it. So they won't be able to see these other 4 reports. If I then look at number 2 is Claire Short. So Claire Short is tutor number 1, sorry, number 2. They're still a tutor, so they're still reports equals number 1, but this time Claire will have access to the data from number 2 and 4, which was contemporary issues and financial analysis. Number 7 is, I'm pretending, is one of the heads of departments. So that's going to be the head of the accountancy department. So I'm specifying that they are accounts department equals 1. And this time they can see any reports which have a number 2 assigned to them. So again, going back to desktop Snap, number 2 would be that one and that one and that one. So they'd actually be able to see all 3 reports, but again, not those ones. Those ones were the ones which were for internal use of running the sort of multiple reports. And then the head of the university, you can see this person's actually got access to download the data as well, as opposed to the other ones could only view the data. They can see any of the reports. They've got access to both of the departments, and they've got access to all the tutors and access to all the different modules. So if I now log in as NP Training 1, so NP Training 1 should have access to financial risk and corporate finance, and should have access, I think, to 2 reports. So if I log out of this person, so there's my shared survey. got access to 2 reports. Do the tutor report. Then it's got John Marder's details. It's got the 2 different courses. John Marder's got access to filter the data based on context. So if I go to module, he's only got access to look at his particular modules. Whilst if I go and look at maybe the university head, so got access to 3 reports this time, and under the filter and context, they've got access to all the different modules, and likewise all the different tutors. Okay, so covered a lot of stuff today and done it very, very quickly. One final sort of bit of advice, really. When you are designing your reports and sort of testing it, it's far easier doing that when you've got data in your survey. One thing I would just advise is that you be a bit careful when you do put your data into your survey, though, your sort of dummy data. If you throw your data in without sort of any thought as to how it would go in there, you may end up sort of sometimes receiving, or when you're running a report, having things pop up in the report which you're not expecting. And that might be because you've got data in questions which shouldn't really have data in them. As in, for example, when I was running my sort of setting this up and running some reports, I was getting things appearing in reports for John Marder which just shouldn't be there, and it's because I'd input data without too much consideration for courses which John Marder would never have taken. So yeah, you just need to be a bit careful how you input data. Likewise, sometimes you might get things like the word no reply appearing somewhere, and again that might just be that you put dummy data in there but you missed off all the options for a particular date or particular month or particular course. So again, just try and put in lots of data for a start, and that way, hopefully, fingers crossed, you won't get sort of any missing data. But yeah, do try and make use of sort of the fact that yes, certain people would have only filled in certain questions. Okay, so that's about it for today. Hopefully that has given you a good insight into the kind of analysis you might look to do to add to a group questionnaire, or indeed just most of your projects in SNAP. Today we focused on sort of a university or college setup, but as mentioned, it would be a very similar idea if it was a project testing, a training program, or as you'll see in next month's webinar, a 360 survey. On screen now are a few QR codes which will take you off to our support pages. The first one will take you off to last week's webinar, which was based around the design of the questionnaire itself. And then the middle one will take you off to a previous webinar I did around based around actually making your reports more visually pleasing, adding in images and cell references to draw out some of the sort of key findings. That's actually the middle one's actually creating reports part 2. There again, there was a much simpler one which was actually just showing you how to build a basic report in the first place, because I appreciate today jumped in at the sort of the deep end and not really showing you the basics of how to build up a report to begin with. But hopefully you have found some of that useful today. If you have got a spare 2 minutes, I'd be grateful if you'd complete our short questionnaire, which is accessed via the QR code on the right. Thank you for joining us, and we'll hopefully see you again soon.